Listen closely, my friends. There is a chilling, inevitable moment waiting for every one of us, a moment right before you draw your final breath, when everything you postponed, ignored, or hid from will suddenly collapse into a single, overwhelming realization. Imagine every apology you never had the courage to give. Every single hour you set on fire, burning it for people who never deserved your warmth. Every fear you obeyed instead of questioning. That moment is rushing toward you, and it is rushing toward me too. And here is the hard truth. Nothing either of us does can stop it. But there is a strange, profound gift hidden inside that terror. The people who have stared directly into the face of death, who looked at it squarely instead of flinching away in fear, are the very same people who finally learned how to truly, vibrantly live. 2,000 years ago, a small band of thinkers in Greece and Rome forged a way of seeing the world that was so sharp, so brutally unsentimental, that it became a lifeline for everyone, from emperors and generals to slaves and prisoners, in their darkest hours. They called it Stoicism. Do not mistake this for a philosophy meant for comfortable afternoons in quiet libraries. It was birthed in the heat of plagues, during long exiles, in heavy chains, on bloody battlefields, and within the damp walls of prison cells. It was built by people who had every rational reason to surrender, yet they refused. And this philosophy survives today, millennia later, because it was never about clever ideas for their own sake. It was a weapon for living, tempered by people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Think about that for a moment. These men were not comfortable academics theorizing from a distance about suffering they had never touched. One had been a slave whose leg was deliberately broken by his master. One buried nearly every child he ever loved. One was exiled from everything he held dear, twice, and forced to rebuild his entire life from ashes both times. They did not write about resilience because it sounded noble. They wrote about it because it was the only thing standing between them and total, absolute collapse. And it worked. If you are watching this right now, because your life feels unbearable, because of a crushing loss, a devastating failure, a fear you cannot even name, or because you look in the mirror and no longer recognize the person staring back, know this: you are exactly the person this was written for. What follows are 10 lessons drawn from that ancient weapon, tested by souls who had far less room for error than you do right now. Be warned, these lessons are not designed to be comfortable. Some will feel like a cold hand closing around your throat before it finally lets you breathe again. But if you let them in, if you genuinely allow them to reshape how you view your one and only life, you will walk away from this video a different person than the one who pressed play. Lesson 1. The rope that isn't yours to pull. Picture a solitary lighthouse keeper standing on a crumbling cliff during the fiercest storm of the year. Giant ships are being tossed about like weightless driftwood. Somewhere out there in the chaos, sailors are screaming into a howling wind that swallows every sound before it can travel even a few feet. The keeper cannot calm the violent sea. He cannot reverse the gale-force winds. He cannot reach into that freezing, black water and pull a single drowning man to safety with his own bare hands. His only task, the only thing he has ever been able to do, is to keep his light burning steady, so that whoever manages to survive the night has something fixed, reliable, and bright to steer toward. Most people spend their entire, precious lives trying to control the storm instead of tending their own light. They rage at traffic that doesn't know, and certainly doesn't care, that they even exist. They spend hours replaying heated arguments with people who have already forgotten the conversation ever happened. They lie awake at 3 a.m., obsessively rewriting a past that will never change, no matter how many times they run the tape in their heads. Epictetus, a man who endured years of being chained before he ever spent a single day free, built his entire foundation of teaching on one brutal, clarifying distinction. Some things are entirely within your power, and everything else is not. Confusing these two realities is the root of nearly every unnecessary suffering you have ever felt. Your reputation? That isn't yours. The opinions others hold of you? Not yours. The final outcome of your effort, the result at the end of the road? That, too, is not yours. What is actually yours is smaller than you think, yet infinitely more powerful than you realize. Your judgments, your choices, and your deliberate effort in this exact moment, right now, as you listen to this sentence, that is the entire territory you actually govern. And it is enough. It has always been the only thing that determined whether you suffered or whether you rose above it. Think about how much of your day is swallowed by things you cannot touch. The comment section under a post you should have never read, the promotion someone else snatched for reasons unrelated to your talent, or the rain on the one day you desperately needed the sun. None of it moves an inch, no matter how hard you grip it. Every second spent fighting the storm is a second stolen from the light you were meant to keep burning. Building on this understanding, we must realize that dwelling on these uncontrollable variables isn't just a waste of time. It is a betrayal of your own purpose. Consider how much of your day is consumed by things you simply cannot touch. Those toxic comments beneath a post you never should have read, a promotion someone else received for reasons entirely unrelated to your talent, or perhaps the gloom of a rainy day when you desperately needed the sun. None of these things will move even a single inch, no matter how hard you grip them. Every fleeting second you spend wrestling with these phantoms is a second stolen from the light you were put here to keep burning for the people who actually need to see it. Please understand, this is not an act of resignation, and it certainly isn't giving up, even if it feels that way at the start. It is quite the opposite. It is the profound realization that your energy is finite, precious, and non-renewable. You will never, ever get today back once it has slipped away. Every ounce of focus you expend on the uncontrollable is an ounce you cannot spend building the one thing that was always within your reach: yourself, your character, and your response to whatever life decides to throw your way next. There is a simple, time-tested exercise worth trying the next time you feel your grip tightening around something you cannot change. Ask yourself this question, out loud, if you have to: is this situation something I can act on directly, right now, with my own two hands? Or is it something I can only watch and hope for? If it is the latter, the grip you are holding isn't protecting you from anything. It is only exhausting you, hour after hour and day after day, with absolutely no return on your investment. Meanwhile, the actual work of your life, the meaningful work, sits untouched, waiting patiently for the attention you keep squandering elsewhere. There is a second, quieter part of this lesson that most people miss entirely. Once you finally stop fighting the sea, you are left with an uncomfortable amount of silence, because you no longer have a stormy villain to blame for your unhappiness. But that silence is not empty. It is the sacred space where responsibility finally lives, uncontested, waiting for you to pick it up. Most people avoid that silence for years, because blaming the storm is significantly easier than tending the light. Yet, the lighthouse keeper who stops blaming the wind is the only keeper whose light ever actually saves anyone. This leads us to lesson 2, the verdict you signed without a trial. Imagine a woodcutter walking past the same bent, twisted tree every single day for years on his way into the forest. Everyone in the village calls it the ugly tree or the failed tree, the one that grew wrong from the very beginning. Then, one winter, a violent storm sweeps through and flattens every straight, proud tree in the forest, snapping them clean at the trunk in a single night. When the sun rises, the bent, twisted tree is the only one still standing. Its very deformity had quietly taught it, year after year, how to bend without ever breaking. Nothing about the tree itself changed that night, only the village's judgment changed, and with it, everything about how the tree was finally perceived. This is the second brutal insight the Stoics handed down to us across 2 millennia. It is never the event itself that truly wounds you. It is the verdict you pass on the event, usually within a fraction of a second, usually without a fair trial, without evidence, and without any real chance of appeal. If someone cancels plans, You rule silently and instantly that you are unwanted. If you lose a job, you rule just as fast that you are worthless. But look closely. The event happened out there in the world, while the wound happened in here, inside your own private courtroom. You have been the one holding the gavel the entire time. This realization, that our reactions are merely opinions and not objective facts, would later become the seed for entire branches of modern psychology dedicated to retraining these automatic, punishing self-verdicts. But long before any lab-based science proved it, Stoic teachers were whispering the same truth to their students in a plague-ridden, war-torn world, stripped of every modern comfort. They taught, strip away your opinion about what happened to you, and examine what is actually left underneath. Usually, the reality is far smaller and far more survivable than the catastrophic story you built around it in the space of a single panicked heartbeat. You are not required to believe every harsh verdict your mind hands down the instant something goes wrong. You are allowed to appeal. You are allowed to ask, is this actually true, or is this just my mind's familiar way of choosing to suffer? By learning to challenge your initial reactions, you transition from being a victim of your thoughts to becoming their master. You are allowed to ask yourself, is this actually true, or is this just the fastest, most familiar path my brain knows how to take? You see, your mind has become an expert at suffering simply because it has practiced that exact routine 1,000 times before. But those who master the art of questioning their own narrative stop being victims. They become judges. This shift changes the entire downstream flow of your daily existence, transforming how you move through the world. Think about how differently that woodcutter would have viewed the twisted tree had he judged it accurately from day one, rather than waiting for a violent storm to prove him wrong. The tree was never actually ugly. It was resilient from the very start. The village's label said far more about their narrow, superficial definition of beauty than it ever said about the nature of the tree. Isn't it likely that the same applies to some harsh verdict you passed on yourself years ago? A verdict you have never once thought to appeal? The next time life catches you off guard or something wounds you, try this. Separate the raw event from the story you immediately wrapped around it. The event itself is entirely neutral. It happened, and now it is finished. You cannot change a moment that has already passed, no matter how much energy you exhaust wishing it were otherwise. But the story? That is yours, and it is being written in real time. Unlike unchangeable events, stories can always be rewritten with a steadier hand. Consider how much of your personal history has been shaped not by what actually happened, but by the earliest verdict you passed on it, sometimes when you were just a child, far too young to appeal any ruling at all. Maybe it was a single offhand comment from a parent, absorbed as permanent fact, or a failure in front of classmates filed away as a life sentence regarding your own ability. The event itself lasted mere seconds, yet that verdict has been serving its sentence for years, sometimes decades. It has remained entirely unexamined and unappealed, simply because no one ever taught you that the courtroom of your mind is still open for a retrial. This brings us to Lesson 3, turning the blade against the wound. There is an ancient, timeless image of a blacksmith holding a piece of raw iron over an open flame in the dark of a forge. The iron does not choose to be in the fire. It cannot escape the intense heat, and it cannot negotiate with the hammer that is about to fall on it, again and again. It would likely choose to remain soft and shapeless forever, tucked away in a corner, safe and untouched. Yet, it is precisely that unwanted violence, that unchosen suffering, which transforms shapeless metal into something strong enough to hold an edge, something capable of being trusted with real weight in the real world. Marcus Aurelius, a man who navigated an empire through plague, war, and the betrayal of those he trusted, often wrote to himself in the dead of night. He famously noted that the obstacle in the path becomes the path itself, and that what blocks our action can be turned into the action. This wasn't a comforting slogan for him. It was a rigorous working method he used to survive years that would have shattered almost anyone else. Every difficulty placed in front of him was reframed, deliberately and forcibly, as material to be worked with, rather than as a punishment sent to destroy him. Most people treat hardship as proof that life has turned against them personally, as if the universe has singled them out for cruelty. A relationship ends, and they interpret it as evidence they are unlovable. A business fails, and they see it as proof of their inherent incapacity. But consider this. The iron does not interpret the fire as evidence it was never meant to become a blade. The fire is simply the mechanism by which raw material becomes something with an edge, a purpose, and value. Your setbacks are not verdicts on your worth. No matter how convincingly they disguise themselves as such in the heat of the moment, they are, more often than not, the exact temperature required to forge the person you are actually trying to become. This doesn't mean you pretend the pain doesn't exist. That would be its own kind of lie. The iron genuinely burns in the flame. However, there is a profound difference between denying the fire and deciding what the fire is for. Recognizing that your setbacks are actually the very fuel for your transformation, we must decide how to respond to the heat. The blacksmith is certainly not lying about the intense danger of the forge when he warns his apprentice to be cautious. However, there is a monumental difference between denying the fire's existence and intentionally deciding what that fire is meant to achieve. One path leaves you shapeless and fragile, forever terrified of being placed near the flame again, constantly flinching at the mere memory of every burn. The other path, however, leaves you sharp, tempered, and finally useful for something that actually matters, something far heavier and more significant than you could have ever carried before the fire touched you. The next time life throws you into the furnace without asking for your permission, try asking yourself the blacksmith's question instead of the victim's question. Don't ask, "Why is this happening to me?" as though the universe owes you an explanation it has no intention of providing. Instead, ask, "What shape is this heat trying to force out of me?" Because something is always being molded in that moment, whether you choose to cooperate with the process or fight it every step of the way. There is a version of you waiting on the other side of every fire you have ever walked through, a version that simply did not exist before the heat. You cannot meet that stronger self by avoiding the forge. You can only meet them by staying in the flame long enough to be reshaped by it, which, admittedly, is a much harder truth to accept than almost any other lesson on this list. Notice, too, that the blacksmith never asks the fire to be gentler, because a milder flame produces a weaker blade, and a weak blade is guaranteed to fail at the exact moment it is needed most. There is always a profound temptation, when life turns up the heat, to pray solely for relief, for the temperature to drop back down to something comfortable. But comfort was never what forged the edge you are going to need later, in the moments that actually matter. The fire that feels unbearable today is, quite often, the very reason you will still be standing when something far heavier finally arrives in your life. This brings us to lesson 4. The company that writes your character. There is an old story told about two apprentices who began their training on the same day, in the same city, with the exact same raw talent. One was placed among master craftsmen who demanded absolute precision, endless patience, and unwavering honesty in every joint of wood they cut. The other was placed among men who consistently cut corners, lied to their customers, and mocked anyone foolish enough to try doing the work properly. 10 years passed. Neither apprentice ever consciously chose to become the person they became. They simply absorbed, day after invisible day, the standards of the rooms they occupied during their working hours. Seneca warned his students about this invisible contagion nearly 2,000 years before modern research confirmed it. He famously said that we never return from certain company with the same character we brought into it. Something inevitably rubs off on us, whether we notice it happening or not, much like the way a sick man's illness can be transmitted to someone who never even touched him, but simply stood near him and breathed the same air for too long. Character, in this sense, is not built in isolation, sitting alone in a room with your own good intentions. It is built in rooms among people, and most of us never once audit the rooms we spend our entire lives standing in. Have you ever noticed that certain rooms feel incredibly exhausting to leave, while others feel strangely energizing, even when nothing dramatic happened in either one? The exhausting room was quietly asking you to shrink yourself just to fit in. The energizing room was quietly asking you to grow to meet it. Most people never name this difference out loud, so they keep choosing the exhausting room simply because it feels familiar, mistakenly equating familiarity with belonging. Ask yourself honestly, what standard are the 5 rooms you spend the most time in quietly training you to accept as normal? If the people around you treat mediocrity as an acceptable outcome, some part of your spirit is being trained to accept mediocrity, too. No matter how loudly you insist otherwise in your own head, if those around you gossip, cut corners, or shrink from difficulty at the first sign of resistance, you are absorbing a blueprint for those exact behaviors, even if you never once agreed to them on purpose. Please understand, this is not a justification for cruelty toward the people currently in your life, nor is it a call to abandon everyone who has ever disappointed you. It is, rather, a call to radical honesty about what the proximity of others is doing to your character, silently and relentlessly, every single day, whether you choose to pay attention to it or not. You certainly don't have to burn every bridge tonight in some theatrical act of self-improvement. Instead, you can start choosing, deliberately, and with clear intention, to spend more of your limited, precious hours in the company of people whose standards are higher than the ones you currently hold for yourself. Conversely, spend fewer hours near those who have quietly been giving you permission to stay exactly where you are, stagnating in your comfort zone. There is also a mirror side to this lesson that most people conveniently forget. You are not merely a passive passenger absorbing the standards of the rooms you enter. You are also, whether you like it or not, contributing your own standard to every room you walk into. Someone else's character is being written, in some small but meaningful part, by the version of you that they spend time with. This isn't a burden meant to paralyze you with guilt. It is simply the other half of the truth. It means that the choice to raise your own standard is never a purely selfish act. It's a ripple effect. The rooms you inhabit are writing your character regardless of your awareness, but you are also writing a line or two into the character of every person standing near you. The only real choice available to any of us is whether we select the rooms we enter, and the influence we contribute to them on purpose, or by total accident. This brings us to Lesson 5, Rising Before Your Excuses Do. There is a particular kind of farmer, the kind whose crops never fail, even in a year of brutal drought or devastating flood, who wakes before the sun does. He doesn't do this because someone is standing over him forcing it. He does it because he understands a fundamental truth most people never learn in their entire lives. The field does not care how tired he feels this morning. The weeds will grow whether he slept well or not. The only variable he actually controls, the only lever available to him, is whether he shows up to meet the day before the day has already decided everything for him. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, argued with himself about this exact struggle in the pages of his private journal, the same journal he never intended for another human eye to read. He wrote openly about the pull of the warm blanket and the heavy temptation to stay curled beneath the covers instead of rising to do the work he was, in his own words, born to do, as a human being with a finite number of mornings left. If the most powerful man on earth had to argue himself out of bed on some mornings, you are certainly not weak for feeling that same pull every single day. You are simply human, exactly as he was underneath the title and the crown. But notice carefully what he did with that pull instead of simply losing to it. He didn't indulge it, but he also didn't shame himself for feeling it, because shame rarely gets anyone out of bed faster. He simply asked himself a sharper question than the blanket was asking him. The blanket whispers, "Wouldn't it feel better to stay warm just a few more minutes?" But the sharper question asks, "What was I actually made for? And is staying warm really the answer I want to give myself on this particular morning?" Most mornings, the blanket wins by default simply because nobody ever bothered to ask the sharper question out loud before reaching for the snooze button. Winning the first hour of your day is rarely about discipline in the way most people imagine it. It isn't all gritted teeth and white-knuckled willpower dragged out of thin air. It is about deciding the night before which question you are going to let win in the morning, before you are even tired enough to negotiate with your own impulses. People who rise early and build extraordinary lives out of ordinary days aren't immune to the pull of comfort. They have simply trained themselves to notice the pull, name it honestly the moment it arrives, and choose the sharper question anyway, morning after morning, until it stops requiring a fight at all and begins to feel like who they simply are. This discipline of winning the first hour is vital, because there is a deeper reason why this lesson matters more than it first appears. The way you meet the very first hour of your day sets the psychological tone your mind will use to interpret every hour that follows it. If you lose that first hour to the comfort of the blanket and the weight of your excuses, you effectively spend the rest of the day in a slightly apologetic, catch-up posture, desperately chasing a version of the day that has already slipped through your fingers before it even began. However, if you win that first hour, even by a small margin, every hour that follows inherits a distinct advantage it didn't have to earn on its own. Tomorrow morning, before you instinctively reach for the excuse that is already waiting for you, ask yourself that sharper question: what was I actually born to do today, knowing that I have a limited number of mornings left on this earth? Is 5 more minutes of warmth really worth trading your purpose for? There is nothing glamorous about this practice, which is precisely why so few people actually apply it. It doesn't promise a sudden, dramatic transformation overnight. It only promises that tomorrow, and the morning after, and the one after that, you will meet the day slightly earlier than your excuses expected you to. That small margin, repeated faithfully over months, becomes the largest and least visible advantage a person can ever build. Before we move on, pause here for a moment. If you have made it this far, something in what you have just heard is already working on you, whether you've realized it yet or not. Most people watching content like this will let it wash over them for an hour, and then return tomorrow to the exact life they were living before they press play. That is not a judgment against you. It is simply the ordinary gravity every human being must fight, the stubborn pull back toward the familiar, even when that familiar life has long since stopped serving them. So, here is an honest question worth sitting with. Of the lessons you have heard so far, which one landed the hardest? And why do you suspect that particular one resonated so deeply? Usually, the lesson that stings the most is not a coincidence. It is the one pointing directly at the exact place in your life where you have been quietly avoiding the truth for longer than you care to admit, even to yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts. This leads us to Lesson 6, rehearsing the loss before it arrives. There was once a wise merchant who, before every voyage, forced himself to sit quietly in his own home and imagine the worst possible outcome of the journey ahead. He pictured the storm that sinks the ship without warning, the cargo lost forever to the ocean floor, and years of accumulated work erased in a single night of bad weather that no one could have predicted. His rivals thought him morbid, perhaps even cursed, for dwelling on disaster before it had any chance to occur. But when disaster eventually did strike, as it strikes everyone eventually, no matter how carefully they plan, he was the only one who did not fall apart. Why? Because some part of him had already survived this exact loss 100 times over in the privacy of his own mind, long before it ever touched his real life. The Stoics practiced a version of this deliberately, sitting with the possibility of losing what they loved most, not to invite misfortune closer, but to strip fear of its single greatest weapon, the element of surprise. Seneca wrote that nothing should ever come as a total surprise to a person who has properly prepared themselves. We should send our minds ahead into every possible difficulty on the road, so that when trouble finally arrives, we greet it as something rehearsed rather than something that ambushes us from behind while our guard is down. Most people do the exact opposite. They avoid even the thought of loss, as if merely considering it might summon it into being. And so, when loss inevitably arrives, it confronts them as a total stranger they were never prepared to meet. This is not pessimism. A pessimist expects disaster and does nothing at all, waiting helplessly to be crushed. What we are talking about is closer to a soldier checking every single buckle on his armor before a battle. He sincerely hopes he will never have to fight, but he checks those buckles because if the battle comes anyway, he would rather meet it standing on solid ground than be caught completely off guard with his armor half-fastened. By confronting these potential losses head-on, you unlock a hidden sense of freedom that is easy to overlook at first glance. Once you have honestly sat with the worst-case scenario and realized that you are still standing, even within the confines of that thought, something in you quietly relaxes for the first time in years. You no longer waste your daily energy constantly defending yourself against a catastrophe you were secretly terrified to even name out loud. That catastrophe has already been named, examined, and survived within the safety of your own imagination, leaving behind only the ordinary, manageable work of living, now unburdened by the crushing weight of an unspoken fear. Try sitting just once this week with the honest thought of losing something you currently take for granted, whether it is your health, a cherished relationship, or the life you have painstakingly built. The goal here is not to torture yourself with worst-case scenarios on a loop, but simply to notice, with genuine relief, that you remain intact even while contemplating the loss. You will find that the version of you who survives that imagined hardship is significantly sturdier and steadier than the version of you who refuses to ever look at it directly. It is worth noting that the people who fear loss the least are rarely the people who have lost the least in their lives. Without exception, they are the people who stopped pretending that loss was avoidable and started preparing for it, much like our merchant, who lived in peace long before the storm ever reached his harbor. Moreover, there is a strange, beautiful side effect that emerges once you practice this regularly, one the merchant likely noticed but rarely spoke about. The things you have honestly rehearsed losing paradoxically become the things you appreciate far more while you still possess them. Think of the sailor who has imagined the ship going down. He watches the sunrise from the deck with a reverence the sailor who has never considered the danger will never understand. Real gratitude doesn't usually arrive on its own. It arrives on the back of a clear-eyed look at how easily everything you hold could be taken from you tomorrow. This brings us to Lesson 7, the applause you were never owed. Imagine an old street performer who, for years, built his entire sense of self-worth around the size of the crowd that gathered to watch him each afternoon. On days when the crowd was large and generous, he felt invincible, certain of his talent and his place in the world. But on days when the street was empty and quiet, he felt like a fraud who had wasted his entire life on a skill nobody actually wanted to see. It took him until his final years to notice something devastating about this arrangement. His skill had never once changed based on the size of the crowd watching him. Only his sense of self had fluctuated, and he had spent decades handing complete strangers the power to decide whether he was allowed to feel proud of his own two hands. Epictetus taught his students to draw a hard, unforgiving line between what belongs to us and what belongs entirely to the opinions of others. Applause belongs strictly to the latter. No matter how intoxicating it feels in the moment, it is not yours. It was never yours to begin with. It arrives and departs based on moods, fleeting trends, and circumstances that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual worth of the work you performed that day. The moment you build your identity on the foundation of applause, you have quietly handed over the deed to your own self-worth to a fickle crowd that will likely change its mind about you before the week is even over. This does not mean you should stop caring whether your work is genuinely good. Indifference to quality is not what any of this is about. Rather, it means that the measure of whether your work is excellent should live inside your own honest, demanding standards, not within the fluctuating size of the crowd happening to watch you on any given afternoon. The performer whose skill remained exactly the same on both the crowded and empty days had already done the actual work required long before either crowd showed up or failed to. What changed was never the work itself. What changed was only how loudly the world happened to be clapping for reasons entirely beyond his control. Ask yourself honestly, and please, do not flatter yourself with the answer, how much of what you do each day is aimed at genuine excellence, and how much is secretly aimed at being seen doing something that merely looks like excellence to whoever happens to be watching. The two are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside for a very long time. Only one of these approaches will still feel worth pursuing on the day the crowd finally stops watching entirely. And eventually, for every single one of us, without exception, that applause does stop. There is a quiet, revealing test worth running on yourself right now. Imagine the piece of work you are proudest of, but visualize it in a world where no one, not a single soul, will ever know you were the one who created it. Does it still feel worth having made? If your answer is an honest yes, then you have discovered something truly real, something that belongs to you in the way the Stoics intended. But if the answer is no, you have gently, and without judgment, identified the exact place where the applause had quietly become the entire point. Build a version of your work and the version of your character that would still feel worth having even if no one ever clapped for it again for the rest of your life. That version, and only that version, was ever truly yours to keep. There is a particular kind of serenity that settles over a person once they finally stop performing for the crowd, though it is worth naming honestly. It can feel, at first, almost like a profound loss. The applause was loud and exhilarating, and its sudden absence can feel like a heavy, suffocating silence pressing in from every direction. However, underneath that silence, if you are brave enough to remain within it without running back toward the noisy distraction, you will find something far sturdier than applause ever was. Your own opinion of your own work, arrived at honestly, and answerable to no one but yourself. This brings us to Lesson 8, the hourglass you refuse to look at. There was once an old clockmaker who spent his entire working life building precise, intricate instruments to measure time for other people, complex mechanisms that ticked away the hours of strangers he would never personally meet, while somehow never once turning that same relentless, vital precision toward his own remaining days on this earth. On the morning he finally understood, with total clarity, that his own hourglass had nearly run empty, he didn't feel the paralyzing despair he expected. Instead, he felt something much closer to relief. For the first time in decades, every single remaining grain of sand suddenly mattered enormously, and he immediately stopped wasting the ones he had left on trivial matters that had never deserved them. Seneca made a claim that still unsettles people today, nearly 2,000 years after he first penned it. Most life is not lost through some single dramatic tragedy. It is lost quietly, a day at a time, handed away to distraction, delay, and the comfortable, unexamined assumption that there will always be more of it later. He argued that we do not actually possess a short life. Rather, we simply waste a great deal of the one we were given. This waste is so gradual, so invisible day by day, that most people never even notice their hourglass emptying until there is almost nothing left inside to notice. Looking honestly at your own mortality is not the morbid, dark exercise most people assume it must be. It is closer to what that clockmaker finally did in his twilight years, turning his precision instrument toward his own remaining time instead of only measuring everyone else's. When you actually allow yourself to feel, for even a single honest minute, that your days are numbered, and that the number is entirely unknown to you, something remarkable happens almost instantly. Petty arguments stop feeling worth having. The apology you have been withholding out of pride suddenly feels urgent, and the work you have been postponing for Sunday suddenly demands, quietly but insistently, to be started today. This is not about becoming morbidly afraid of death, or letting that fear paralyze the very life you are trying to protect. It is about using the undeniable fact of death as a filter for everything you do while you are still fortunate enough to be alive. Ask yourself, Would this petty argument matter to me on the final day of my life? Would this grudge I have been carrying for years, or this fear that has quietly shaped so many of my decisions, hold any weight then? Most of what currently feels enormous in your life shrinks almost instantly the moment it is placed next to the true, undeniable scale of the hourglass. Once you begin viewing your life through the lens of your own mortality, a profound and unique form of courage begins to emerge. This is not the reckless, impulsive kind of bravery that makes headlines. Rather, it is a quiet, steady courage rooted in absolute clarity. When our clockmaker finally faced the reality of his remaining time, he didn't suddenly become reckless with his days. Instead, he became profoundly precise, applying the same master-level craftsmanship to his own life that he had previously reserved only for the instruments he built for others. I challenge you to look at your own remaining time with that same level of honesty at least once this week. When you do, begin to spend what remains of your life like someone who finally understands that time was never an unlimited resource, regardless of how it felt on all those ordinary mornings when you lazily assumed another day would always be waiting for you. This leads us to Lesson 9, the fortress that cannot be stormed. Imagine an ancient, walled city enduring a brutal, relentless siege. For weeks on end, arrows rain down upon the outer battlements, and the enemy exhausts every possible method to breach the defenses before the winter cold sets in. Yet, deep inside that city, shielded by layer upon layer of stone, sits an inner chamber, a sanctuary that no siege has ever managed to reach. This is a place the attacker simply cannot touch, no matter how long they camp outside the gates, because it was never built in a space where their weapons could reach in the first place. The Stoics described something remarkably similar existing within every single human being who has ever walked this earth, an inner citadel. This is a private sanctuary that external circumstances cannot storm, unless, of course, we ourselves panic, open the gates, and invite them in willingly. Insults, professional setbacks, the cruelty of others, and even the betrayal of those you once trusted, all of these can hammer against the outer walls of your life relentlessly, day after day. Yet, none of it can actually touch the innermost chamber of your being. Your judgment, your character, and your capacity to choose your response remain untouchable, unless you personally hand over the key to whoever happens to be attacking you that day. Most people live as though every unkind word or minor setback has already breached the inner chamber, reaching the very core of who they fundamentally are. But if you look closely enough, you will realize that the actual damage is almost always self-inflicted. It isn't caused by the enemy outside the walls at all. It is caused by the gatekeeper inside, the part of you that panics amidst the noise and confusion, throwing the gates wide open when you were never actually forced to. The siege outside your walls is often loud, frightening, and intimidating, but it is completely incapable of reaching the room that actually matters unless you are the one who lets it in out of fear, exhaustion, or doubt. Building this inner fortress does not happen by accident, nor does it happen overnight, no matter how deeply you crave that protection. It is built exactly like any real fortress, one deliberate stone at a time. It is constructed through the small, unglamorous, daily practice of noticing when you are about to surrender your key, and choosing, in that exact moment, to hold on to it just a little longer. Every time you feel provoked and pause before reacting, you are laying another stone in that wall. Every time an insult strikes, and you consciously notice it landing on the outer wall rather than sinking into your inner chamber, you are fortifying your spirit. There is a strange, liberating comfort in remembering that the siege itself was never personal, even though it feels incredibly targeted in the heat of the moment. The wind does not hate the lighthouse. The arrows do not hate the stone wall they strike against. Most of what attacks your peace each day is simply the ordinary, indifferent chaos of a world that was never built to revolve around your comfort. Once you stop taking the siege personally, you will find it becomes significantly easier to hold the gate closed against it. Armed with the knowledge that your inner sanctuary is yours to protect, you can face any challenge with renewed confidence. The next time life lays siege to you, and it absolutely will, much sooner than you anticipate, remind yourself that those walls were specifically designed to withstand exactly this kind of pressure. The only true danger has always been the gatekeeper within you opening those doors from the inside. And you, more than anyone else in this world, are the sole guardian who holds that particular key. It is worth remembering, however, that no great city remained standing throughout history simply because its walls were strong on the day they were built. Walls eventually crack, iron gates rust, and watchmen grow careless after years of peace. Your inner fortress functions in much the same way. It requires constant maintenance. This isn't because the design is flawed, but because anything built to withstand the heavy pressures of life eventually needs its stones repaired and its defenses reinforced. Those people whose composure seems truly unshakable aren't people who built their fortress once and walked away. They are the people who walk those walls daily, out of habit, long after the last siege has ended. This brings us to our final lesson. Lesson 10, the debt you were never asked to owe. There is an image worth holding in your mind for a long reflective moment. Consider a bird raised its entire life in a magnificent, gilded cage. It is fed, sheltered, and admired by every passerby who stops to comment on its beauty. Now, contrast that with a second bird, wild, unowned, soaring somewhere over open country with no guarantee of food and no cage to protect it from the harsh weather. The caged bird enjoys comfort, real, undeniable comfort, but it has traded its entire existence for the approval and convenience of whoever happens to hold the key to its door. The wild bird, by contrast, has nothing guaranteed except the freedom to be exactly what it is, storm or no storm. Tragically, so much of human suffering arises from living like the caged bird, quietly performing a version of yourself specifically designed to please whoever happens to be watching at any given moment. We often live convinced, somewhere deep down, that our safety depends entirely on their approval. The Stoics insisted, over and over again, in different words across different empires and centuries, that you do not actually owe anyone that performance. You do not owe the world your compliance with expectations you never agreed to, and never consciously chose for yourself. Real freedom is not the absence of hardship, no matter how comfortable that definition might sound to the weary. Instead, true freedom is the absence of needing anyone else's permission to be exactly who you are underneath it all. This is, admittedly, a terrifying kind of freedom to accept, because the cage was, in its own limited way, comfortable, and the open sky comes without a single guarantee attached to it. Yet, the caged bird never gets to know what it was truly capable of, because it traded that knowledge away the moment it accepted the cage as an acceptable price for comfort. The wild bird, however, risks everything it has every single day, and in exchange, it finally discovers what its wings were built for in the first place, a discovery the caged bird will never once make, no matter how long it lives. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the life you choose to build for yourself, so long as it is constructed with honesty, discipline, and the four classic virtues the Stoics championed: courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. Everything else, every expectation and every comfortable cage ever offered to you in exchange for your freedom, is a debt you were never actually required to pay in the first place, no matter how convincingly it was presented to you as a necessity. As we reflect on these lessons, there is one final, essential truth worth sitting with before we conclude our journey today. The wild bird does not harbor resentment toward the bird in the cage, and in its moments of clarity, the caged bird does not need to resent itself for the choices it has already made. It is never too late to begin opening the door you once constructed for yourself, one small decision at a time. It happens in the same patient, deliberate way the fortress was built stone by stone, or the way the blacksmith's iron was meticulously shaped blow by blow. Freedom is rarely achieved through a single, dramatic leap. It is usually a process of leaving a door left open a little wider each day, until eventually you simply walk through it, no longer needing to struggle with the decision of which bird you would rather have been on the day your own hourglass finally runs empty. Think about that final day, when nothing in your life can be edited or reconsidered anymore. Will you be the one who stayed safe inside the cage that others admired from a distance, or the one who discovered, at whatever cost it demanded, what it actually meant to fly on your own terms? Notice that no one ever builds a cage for you all at once. It is constructed slowly, one small accommodation at a time, one swallowed opinion, one abandoned interest, one quiet surrender to what was expected of you instead of what was true. This means the exit door is built in that very same patient way, one small refusal at a time, one honest opinion spoken instead of buried, one interest picked back up after years of neglect. The cage was never a single choice, and neither is the freedom waiting just on the other side. Across these 10 lessons, one single thread runs quietly through every single one of them. You do not control the storm, the crowd, the siege, or the hourglass, and you never actually did, no matter how desperately you gripped at any of them. But you do control the light you keep burning on the worst nights, the verdict you refuse to sign without a trial, and the shape the fire forces out of you when you least expect it. You control the rooms you choose to stand in, the question you let win each morning, the losses you rehearse honestly, and the work you would still do without a single person clapping for it. You control the brutal honesty you bring to your own mortality, the gate you refuse to open from the inside, and the cage you finally decide one day to leave behind for good. None of this is comfortable, and truthfully, it was never supposed to be. Comfort was never the force that kept Marcus Aurelius ruling through plague and betrayal, kept Seneca writing through repeated exile, or kept Epictetus teaching for decades after spending years in actual chains. What kept them moving forward was the brutal, clarifying knowledge that their remaining days were limited, and were not owed to anyone else. They understood that the only real failure available to any of us in the end is spending those limited days asleep inside a life we never actually chose for ourselves. You are going to die. So am I. Neither of us knows exactly when, how, or whether there will be any warning at all before it happens. But for however many mornings you actually have left on this earth, you now carry something that most people spend their entire lives quietly avoiding: the plain, liberating knowledge that the storm was never yours to control, but the light was always yours to keep burning, no matter how hard the wind blew against it. And today, this exact, ordinary day, is the only day you have ever actually been given to finally start doing it. If any part of this message reached you, do not let it end the moment this video concludes and fade away by tomorrow morning as most things do. Subscribe to the channel and let the next lesson find you, before life eventually forces you to learn it the hard way, in circumstances you would never have chosen for yourself.